There is. So the other thing, there's a good book that I would recommend reading called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. It's a new book, relatively new book. And he details out the ineradicability of inequality. So part of the problem with this process that we just described, where success breeds success and failure breeds failure, is that the people who are succeeding get a disproportionate share of the resource pie, let's say. So, everyone knows that about money, right? Because the 12 richest people in the world, the 85 richest people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2 billion, which seems, well, let's say unfair. Now, it's certainly unequal. Now, whether it's unfair is slightly
Jordan,
different.
The statistic is the eight richest have equal to the bottom 3.5 billion.
Yeah, well, it's probably worse than it was when I looked at this about 3 years ago. So, but it doesn't matter because you get the point. But
it's crazy.
But the thing is that this is not something that only applies to money. It applies to everything that's creatively produced. So the same rule applies to number of records sold by recording artists. The same rule applies to number of books sold by novelists. The same rule applies to number of goals scored by NHL hockey players. The same rule applies to the population of cities and the mass of stars and the size of trees in the jungle. It's like the inequality problem is way more troublesome, again, than mere capitalism. It's a terrible problem. And Scheidel's work, which is really, really interesting, he's traced back inequality 10, 15,000 years. You can do it, for example, let's say you find a Neolithic burial site and there's 200 people in it. So these people would be buried with their possessions. And obviously some of them decay, but some of them don't. And like some of them are buried with gold. Well, hardly any of them. And the tiny proportion of people who are buried with gold are buried with a lot of gold. So you can even derive a Gini coefficient estimate, which is an estimate of inequality from burial sites. And it looks like as soon as you get a surplus, you get inequality. And that's a rough thing, because you might think, well, even in hunter-gatherer societies where there's no surplus, there's still inequality, because there's inequality of friendship, there's inequality of health, and there's inequality of sexual access. And those things are not trivial. But when you're thinking about it purely economically, you start to get inequality as soon as you get a surplus. You think, oh, that's interesting. So there's a natural rule, which is surplus generates inequality. All right, so how do you solve that? And Scheidel's book says, well, that's easy. You just get rid of the surplus. Right, and that's not good. So like he found, and so one of the things he did was statistical analysis, because one of the things you might ask is, well, let's say you have your measures of inequality, and then you can track them around the world, and you can track whether or not the inequality is generated by a right-wing government or a left-wing government. And then you might hope, well, the left-wing governments would ameliorate inequality. There's no evidence for that at all. It doesn't look like inequality is it doesn't look like the amelioration of inequality is within the purview of political organization. Yeah. And you should not hear that with any degree of happiness whatsoever, because the social science on inequality is also clear. As inequality levels increase, societies destabilize. And the best indicator of that, I already mentioned that was work that was done by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson at McMaster University in Canada. They're really interested in what drove male homicide, because most homicide is male on male. It's mostly young males. It's mostly within race. And it's mostly status competition, right? So, and the status competitions get intense where inequality increases. So where everyone's poor, so if you rank order American states and Canadian provinces by inequality, the poorer provinces where everyone's poor, there's no male aggression. And the rich provinces and states where everyone's rich, there's no male homicide. But the states and provinces where inequality is high, the male homicide rate starts to climb up. And it's probably the most aggressive males who get most aggressive most rapidly when inequality increases. So there's a psychological component, but inequality drives male homicide. 0.9 is the correlation, which means that you actually don't need any other explanation for male homicide. Maybe you throw in alcohol just as an extraneous variable. You don't need any other explanation for the male homicide rate than inequality. It's staggering work. It's absolutely staggering work. And so the thing is that a meritocracy will drive inequality. And then you have a problem because people stack up at zero and they can't get out of zero, because that's what happens as inequality increases. People think about when you're playing Monopoly, the game. mean, that's a perfect example of how inequality emerges. Everybody's equal to begin with. Everybody basically plays a random game, because Monopoly is basically a random game. I mean, there's some skill in it, but not much. So it's a random game. So what happens when everyone starts equal and you play a random game? One person ends up with everything. Everyone else stacks up at zero. Now, Scheidell's book basically shows the only way out of that is various forms of war, including revolution, and epidemics. That's it. That's the only thing he's been able to track. And what happens is, well, you level everyone, and then inequality decreases. It's like, well, okay. Like, that doesn't seem like a really great solution. So,
Jordan, this seems to be even more and more pressing with the proliferation of artificial intelligence, robotics, genetic engineering, neuroprosthetics, nanotechnology, and the race between China and the United States and Russia colonizing Mars. How do we actually end up coming to a global consensus on what to do as 8 people equate in wealth to the bottom?
Well, I don't see. This is why we have to have an intelligent discussion about this, because on the one hand, it's pretty obvious that modern economies are doing a damn good job of lifting people rapidly out of abject poverty. Okay, but at the same time, the inequality of economic inequality, by some measures at least, is increasing, and that does have this destabilizing effect. And so then the question is, what do you do about it? Well, it's really hard, because in a meritocracy, part of that's driven by segregation by intelligence. And then that's likely exaggerated by the provision of computational power, because a really smart person with a computer is way smarter than a really smart person without a computer, and is way smarter than a person who isn't so smart, either with or without a computer. Right, so the computational technology looks like it's a multiplier, like I'm sure many of you already know. Because there's a huge difference between someone who can really use a computer and someone who's barely computer literate. And way more people are barely computer literate than you know. So here's a good stat. This is, I've really familiarized myself with the IQ literature, and it's a dismal, horrible literature. But you really need to know it, because it's a solid literature, unfortunately. And one of the most terrifying statistics I ever came across was one detailing out the rationale of the United States Armed Forces for not allowing you can't induct anyone into the armed forces in the US if they have an IQ of less than 83. Okay, so let's just take that apart for a minute, because it's a horrifying thing. So the US Armed Forces has been in the forefront of intelligence research since World War I, because they were on board early with the idea that, especially during wartime, when you're ramping up quickly, that you need to sort people effectively and essentially without prejudice, so that you can build up the officer corps so you don't lose the damn war. Okay, so there's real motivation to get it right, because it's a life and death issue. So they used IQ. They did a lot of the early psychometric work on IQ. Okay, so that's the first thing. They're motivated to find an accurate predictor, so they settled on IQ. The second thing was, the United States Armed Forces is also really motivated to get people into the armed forces, peacetime or wartime. Wartime, well, for obvious reasons. Peacetime, because, well, first of all, you got to keep the armed forces going. And second, you can use the armed forces during peacetime as a way of taking people out of the underclass and moving them up into the working class or the middle class, right? You can use it as a training mechanism. And so and left and right can agree on that. It's a reasonable way of promoting social mobility. So again, the armed forces, even in peacetime, is very motivated to get as many people in as they possibly can. And it's difficult as well. It's not that easy to recruit people, so you don't want to throw people out if you don't have to. So what's the upshot of all that? Well, after 100 years, essentially, of careful statistical analysis, the armed forces concluded that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything you could possibly be trained to do in the military at any level of the organization that wasn't positively counterproductive. Okay, you think, well, so what? 83, okay. Yeah, 1 in 10. 1 in 10. That's 1 in 10 people. And what that really means, that as far as I can tell, is if you imagine that the military is approximately as complex as the broader society, which I think is a reasonable proposition, then there's no place in our cognitively complex society for 1 in 10 people. So what are we going to do about that? The answer is no one knows. You say, well, shovel money down the hierarchy. It's like, The problem isn't lack of money. I mean, sometimes that's the problem, but the problem is rarely absolute poverty. It's rarely that. It is sometimes, but rarely. It's not that easy to move money down the hierarchy. So, first of all, it's not that easy to manage money. So, it's a vicious problem, man. And so,
it's hard to train people to become creative, adaptive, problem solvers.
It's impossible. You can't do it. You can't do it. You can
Well, it might take
interfere with
6
their cognitive
years,
ability,
but
you can't do that. Its training doesn't work.
It's not
nearly
going
as
to
well
work in
as people
6 months,
think.
but it could work in 6 years.
No, it doesn't work. Sorry, it doesn't work. Like, the data on that's crystal clear as well. Look, I can give you an example. So I know a bunch of people who run MBA programs, and I've had discussions with them because the thing about an MBA program is if it's selective, it's really hard to get in. It's like getting into Harvard. It's really hard to get into Harvard. You have to have an IQ that places you at least at the 99th percentile, and then you have to be really good at least one or two other things. So it's really hard to get in. Okay, so you think, well, why hire a Harvard graduate? Well, it's the quality of the education. It's like, no, it's not. It's the fact that it's really hard to get in. All of the value of the Ivy League education is in the screening before the education starts. Now, that doesn't mean that people go to Harvard and they get educated, but they'd get just as educated if they went somewhere else. First of all, it's like every university contains more information than any student can ever possibly process. If you're super smart, you can be dropped into a state college somewhere, a low-level state college. You just spend 4 years in the library. You know, like, what are you going to do? Read the whole library? No. Right. So, and the data on this is quite clear. It's like, and it's the same with private schools. The reason that people who go to private schools do better than people who go to public schools is because, generally speaking, the people who go into private schools are smarter. It's not the education that's any better. And so we radically overestimate the degree to which training works. So now you can train people to be stupid, but training them to be smarter than they are is really, really, really hard. So, like I said, it's a dismal literature. And the liberals think everyone's roughly equal and there's a job for everyone, you just have to train them. It's like, no, wrong. And the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone if they just get off their ass and work. It's like, no, that's wrong too. Even though, if you work, that's better. And, well, so that's on the conservative end, but the liberals won't take into account individual differences. Well, obviously, that's part of what the whole politically correct discussion is about. It's like, everyone's the same. It's like, yeah, they're not. You know, and I find it's really annoying, I would say. Like, I love to come to Silicon Valley. I've been here many, many times, and like, it's really something to come here and meet. There's so many people here who are off the scales intelligent, and they're all, clustered together, which is why this place is so unbelievably rich and so unbelievably productive, one of the reasons. But it's also very annoying that it's so left-leaning, because one of the things that the left-leaning Silicon Valley geniuses should understand is that they're the beneficiary of a genetic lottery. Mm-hmm. And they should take that seriously. It's like, yeah, you worked hard. Yes, you're entrepreneurial. Yes, you're on point. You put in your 60 hours a week. You do everything you could. But you have an IQ of 150. And like, that's not your doing, mm-hmm. right? That's something that happened to you. And so you can't be saying, well, it's all me. It's like, no, It's not. It's all you and the genius that you were granted as an infant. That's it. That's what's driving it. Now, that doesn't mean I think that people of disproportionate intelligence shouldn't be rewarded disproportionately. It's possible that they should, because it might be in the best interest of everyone else to dump as much money as possible to the top 2% of the cognitive strata, because they're going to be most generative with it. And even if it's not fair, because you might say, well, just because you won the genetic lottery, does that mean that you should have more money than anyone else? It's like, well, not on the grounds of fairness, but if you have to distribute money, well, who are you going to distribute it to? And I think, was it Ted, who ran CNN? Ted Turner. Mm-hmm. He estimated that if you tried as hard as you could in your entire life, there was no way that you could spend more than $400 million. And so let's say you have more money than that at your disposal. Well, hopefully you're going to do some halfway intelligent things with it, and hopefully you'd expect that the more intelligent people would do more than halfway intelligent things with it. So if you have to have unequal distribution, then a meritocracy is probably the best way to do it. But it still leaves you with this terrible problem, which is, what do you do with all the people who stack up at zero? And the answer isn't have contempt for them because they don't work as hard as you. It's like, yeah, a bunch of them don't, because conscientiousness also predicts success. So among the poor, there are people who don't work, but you never want to underestimate the contribution of cognitive ability. So it's rough, man, and we don't take it seriously, and we don't know what to do about it. And it's clear that as inequality increases, societies destabilize. That's clear. So it's something that has to be dealt with, but we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to efficiently move resources to the bottom end of the competence hierarchy so that things don't destabilize. So, and I've worked with people, lots of people who are at the bottom end of the hierarchy in my clinical practice. And like cocaine addicts, for example, low IQ cocaine addicts. Not all cocaine addicts have low IQ, by the way, but it's just it's a triple whammy, let's say, because if you're a cocaine addict, you're probably also an alcoholic. And so if you're a cocaine addict and you're an alcoholic and you're sort of on the low end of the cognitive distribution, it's like you have a pretty damn rough life. There's a lot of things going wrong for you. And you're really lucky if you're flat broke, because as soon as you get money, you are so done, you cannot believe it. So like, when your unemployment check comes in and you're a cocaine addict alcoholic who isn't employed, the probability that 3 days later you're going to end up face down in a ditch is really, really high. So don't be thinking like it's not so simple that you can just dump money down the competence hierarchy to the people who are in the underclass and expect that that's going to have a salutary effect. I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. Like, money is not an easy resource to use productively. So
is a class
to the degree, I've been a vocal opponent of the radical left, and I can't detest them enough, really, my fundamental position. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that a functioning polity requires a left and a right wing. Absolutely. And the reason it requires a left wing is because inequality is real, and it has to be addressed. It has to be addressed for all the reasons that you described. But that, having said that, there are ways to go about addressing it that are clearly counterproductive. And those were tried to great destructive power in the 20th century, and I don't really think we need to do that again. A corollary to that is we don't know what the productive means are. Now, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I'm thinking, well, how do you solve the problem of inequality? And it has to be something like the moral burden on those who are successful has to be increased. It's something like that. And I think you see that.
I think I wrote this to you, that what's the significance of purchasing a third yacht rather than maybe hiring 50 people to solve a problem in the world.
It's hard. These things aren't so simple. Like, let's say that you decide to go out to a restaurant and your meal is $500, and you might think, well, that's reprehensible. And, well, perhaps you don't think that's reprehensible. But the thing is, it's not a bad way of dispersing extra money. So it's not that obvious what rich people should do with their money that's beneficial. And you think, well, should you buy a third yacht because do you really need it? And, well, that's perhaps a particularly egregious example, but it's not like you're not employing people when you do that. You shouldn't stuff the money in your mattress. We could say that, right? Because that's just pure hoarding. But most people who have money aren't like Scrooge McDuck. They don't have a money bin that they swim in, right? Their money, well, that's the kind of clueless picture of wealth. Most people who have money, their money is out there doing things. It's not like it's in their bedroom, it's in gold coin form. So they're not hoarding it in exactly the same way that perhaps people used to hoard wealth when it wasn't as abstracted and functional in its own terms out there in the economy.
Their money is usually working for them, making them more money.
Yeah, but it's also doing a bunch of other things, and if you're a bad money manager, even if you're wealthy, your money tends to disappear very rapidly. That's another thing that's really worth knowing, is that there is a 1%, and that 1% does have a disproportionate amount of the money, and 1% of that 1% has an even more disproportionate amount of the money. It scales all the way up the measurement spectrum, let's say, but there's actually quite a bit of mobility within that 1%. So you have a 10% chance in your lifetime in the United States of being in the top 1% for at least a year. Now, that's not like 100% chance, but it's 1 in 10. Mm-hmm. It's not dismal, So partly what you hope for is that there's some genuine upward mobility. But then I think the other thing that you hope for is that people who are disproportionately successful take it upon themselves to do everything they possibly can to do whatever they can that's the best possible thing to do with their money. And, you know, I'm kind of an admirer of Bill Gates for a variety of reasons, but he's doing a really good job of putting the boots to the world's 5 worst transmissible diseases, you know, and that's going quite nicely. You know, they're making some real, polio's just about defunct.
Yep.
They're making some real progress with malaria. Like, there's almost nothing that could possibly be done for Africa that would be more useful than to get rid of malaria. Sleeping sickness would be another one that would be really useful to eradicate. And so I would say that the long-term solution, assuming that there is one, to the problem of inequality is that people who are disproportionately fortunate, let's say, or successful, or both, take the moral duty of doing the best possible good that they can with the money that they generate.
Correct.
But the other thing I think that's sort of interesting about that is I actually don't think there's anything more interesting to do with your money than
Correct.
that. It's like, can you think of anything more interesting to do with your money than to find a really difficult problem that causes a bunch of people suffering and then try to fix it? It's like,
It's amazing.
if you have a clue, that's got to be a little better than a third yacht.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's pretty low. Well, it's kind of a low, like that conspicuous consumption thing at some point, it's just, if you have any sense, at some point, that's just not very impressive.
Could another way to address the